Yours, Comrade Yunus.
Okay, so welcome, comrades, and our thanks to you for joining this two-weekly Jack Simon School class. And today we're very lucky to have the former Statistician General. You know, the ANC, we have the SG. Well, Dr. Pali Lehohla is actually the SG of the state, more powerful position. I only wish that we had taken his and their work more seriously, because it seems to me that if we had used the statistics, the very valuable statistics that they worked on in government and in state and us as political parties, we'd all have advanced this country much more than we've able to do and avoided many of the problems we currently do. It's regrettable that the excellent work done wasn't used by all of us more than we did. So I think all of you know him. Who in this country doesn't? He made alive. He made entertaining. He made interesting what were raw statistics at some stage. And he made alive, actually, as I said, stats, and made it relevant to our lives as few would have done. Apart from which, his charismatic presence, his colorful suits, far from the dour, sort of like serious, gray suited types that you normally find. I think he must have made, I'm sure, an impact globally as well for being rare in that regard. And we thank him for his wonderful work that he continues to do long after he left that position. So he, of course, is also, as we mentioned in our little digital poster, he was, of course, for 17 years our SG of the state, to remind you. Is chair of, has been chair of Africa Symposium for Statistical Development, chair of the United Nations Statistics Commission, and chair of Statistics Commission Africa, and is designer of the Lehohla Ledger. We're very delighted to have you here. Never mind you disappointed us without having a purple suit, but I like the hat you have. And no doubt you'll be as forceful and charismatic as you are. And we're very pleased to have you. And we thank you once again for making yourself available. Comrades, just to remind you, the responsibility for tackling the questions and the contributions we make is not simply that of the SG. It's for all of us, and we must engage with each other. It's a discussion. People are free to say whatever you want to say, and also engage with each other's inputs. Also, we'd like more women to be participating in these classes. We're disappointed it's not working. We please urge them, and younger people, please, right? So over then to you, SG.
Oh, no, thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much for being invited. It looks like the people's statistician has become I'm afraid that I have appropriated that term and put it there. I looked at it, I thought I would remove it so that I don't appropriate a term that belongs to you or given to you to me by yourself. And leave it for you to say so rather than myself to claim it. And I'm going to present some work that I found very interesting myself, which is xenophobia, identity in the tenuous belly of contestation. And in short, what I'm arguing is that this whole fight over resources, whether it's for people who are legal or not legal in South Africa, is not the main issue. The main issue is the siphoning machinery that has been unleashed on all African countries largely. That is at play. What we see are just the consequences, the peripheral consequences of the central question of what has been unleashed unto us by capital. Especially in South Africa, which is the most industrialized country on the continent of Africa. But that happens also against the background or backdrop of South Africa having been expected by the rest of the continent to be free, and everybody joined in very hilarious and very interesting ways to see South Africa as the last born. Yet, having been the last born, expectations and everything, I must say, to say the least, we have been very disappointing. So this is the issue. So the core thesis of my paper is identity as a weapon. That is, xenophobia is not so much a moral failing. Rather, it is a morbid symptom of something that has not been corrected spatially in our economy. And into that vacuum, then, of material security, identity becomes the primary defensive currency. Into that vacuum has matched this identity as the primary defensive currency. And this has been driven by the hidden hand of unconstrained, systematically things that drain human vitality from localized, what I call meshes. That is, I'll talk about the mesh. And these meshes feed corporate enclaves. And then, of course, that creates a zero-sum war for survival amongst those who have been forced to contest. Not that the ruling class and the elite escape this. In many ways, it does affect them because they cannot, that contradiction is not a contradiction that can go on forever. It has to collapse at some point. So I'm using the lens from 1985 to 2026 because I've been involved in statistics, particularly those of the census, from when I started running the census of Botswana in 1985 up to now when I'm not running the census, but I'm using the information. So I'm bringing a humanity vitality tracking system for over 40 years. And then, of course, with Botswana to post-apartheid, and then living out from shacks. And I've created this ledger, which really has facilitated the possibility of very deep dive analysis in this information that has been there. I do so through an out-in method as opposed to in-out method. The out-in method, if one were to capture it in terms of the mission questions that many people have tried to ask, such as Magubane, when with Legasik and Wolpe spoke about the preservation, what is it, the dichotomy between preserving but destroying at the same time, where they knew that they have destroyed, has appearances of being preserved, like traditional ways of living, like land ownership and so on. And that being done through a very fundamental economic system of migrant labor. Preservation, yes, dissolution, preservation context, dichotomy that Legasik and others talk about. More lately, people like Stiglitz have asked the question on poverty, and Amartya Sen has spoken about freedom as development. Piketty has tried to discuss this from a point of inequality. What is this inequality? We see all those contestations or the questions that are being asked, like Mazukatu on a mission state. All those questions manifest themselves very potently in South Africa. So what I've done is to deal with the question of Friedman, who was the key intellectual power behind Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And indeed, if he was alive, he would be a key advisor to Trump as we deal with these issues of Afro and xenophobia, all combined in one, which is a very sad part when human beings should be living in harmony, given the powers that artificial intelligence bring in easing life. So I'm bringing this out-in method to illustrate that the way we have been measuring, which is the way I've been measuring anyway, of in-out, has actually been deceptive. And I've written a paper on the Sunday. Tomorrow it will be out. Comes to me to discuss the GDP. He was head of GDP, and he was engaging me on the issue of the head office effect. And we didn't have a solution to the head office effect. That Gauteng, although has a tendency to exaggerate the size of its economy, because the reports come through the head office, just showing the extractive nature, even in information management of a head office, the centralization, that the areas from whence these things are done are not reported, but they are aggregated as a siphon and then exported out. So I'm dealing with that problem that Manamela confronted us with at State SA. He's moved to Reserve Bank now, and long after I've left office, I have been able to resolve this head office feature by looking at the study of economics, particularly of national accounts, from an out-in instead of in-out. So Honorable Karim and others who used to be at Parliament when we were reporting, now it's time for me to confess that, well, these are the weaknesses of how we measure GDP. And in South Africa, because of the head office aggregation effect, areas that produce even better probably are undermined by the reports that come in consolidated reports from industry. And those industries are, because of their location, or rather their head office location, they tend to siphon. And the main theme throughout will be about dealing with the siphon. What do we do with this siphon? Because it is at the center of xenophobia is the siphon machinery. And until we understand that siphon, we'll always be fighting amongst ourselves for crumbs. So, well, what is the toponymic, which is what I've been discussing, the toponymic character of this siphon? And you look at Alfred Nzo to Pikinini Transkei. Men from Alfred Nzo come to Phokeng, where they mine platinum. Because of their place of origin, the place has now been called Pikinini Transkei, and they have been identified as such. I remember when we were running the census of 2001, I had to approach the Bafokeng. They had invited me and saying, you know, we want to know how many people are the Bafokeng of Phokeng, and not these people that are coming from elsewhere, like those who had settled in Sifikile, which were coming from Alfred Nzo, or the Marikana tragedy, mainly claiming the lives of people from the Transkei. So this siphon has this toponymic character of people living in several spaces at the same time and being paid a salary of a boy, just as Martin Legasik and Harold Rolpe and Magubani dealt with this conservation, dissolution dichotomy. So the spatial fracture here, we can see the informal settlement as a labor reservoir, not only in people come from, but it becomes a labor reservoir just outside the mining systems. And of course, by so doing, this decouples massive resource wealth from localized residential safety. As you can see, the product of these people that are in these shacks serves in the heavy markets where food is in the hundreds of dollars, but where they themselves who produce this wealth stay in this. And that's where you see the siphoning in a very classical and almost vulgar face. And these situation on human lives in crowded, on a shallow economic floor is the source and the cause of xenophobia, Afrophobia, call it that. Now, The gory reminder of this is Marikana, September 2012 or August 2012, where 34 miners were gunned down, largely from Alfred Nzo in the Eastern Cape, for asking for not much, but a wage that will make their pain less painful. But they had to be killed for that. It's part and parcel of the machinery. When we see people fighting each other, the cause of this is much sinister and hidden and buried in the high offices in Sandton, where the GDP of Northwest is shortchanged and reported as the GDP of Sandton. Now, as a consequence of this, the hostage, and they tend to provide some fallacious floor to service people who are undermined by capital substantively. And here the structural feature, the reality of where the people are, and the reality of asset anchoring is the matrix through which I would like to take this discussion forward, where we look at economic flow up here, and in fact, you see the immediate capital flight from Northwest, Pugeng to Sandton, and Sandton, it just gets recorded, and then it is out of the country. And there is no localized wealth retention. And this B column here is where we actually want to move towards, to move from this passive A here, where grants are served as palliatives to the malady of capital. And of course, here the impact here is at the individual level is just survival. And here we want to say, well, we need to have an asset base for growth, for development. And then, of course, when it comes to the youth, it really becomes a not in employment, education, of training. Those are the spatial traps. And of course, we would like to go into active production owners. And then, of course, at the social level, a social result is resource contestation, which then is the xenophobia that we see. And what we have to replace that with is a communal cooperation. So this path here, driven by these forces, is what causes xenophobic. Now, the core siphon is Sandton. And Sandton, Cape Town, where socioeconomic health is, and massive capital aggregation is seen against the flatlands of Alex, where you can hardly actually even walk without sewer. Fortunately now, Sandton is having a bit of the sewer itself, if as though we are compensating for bad governance. It shares in that too. Now, the reason B, which is the corridor dynamics, is the spine of trade, where Durban Hub, Cattle Ridge, health systems there are moderate, and the dynamics at velocity value, it's in transit. It moves, bypasses the local nodes between interchanges. So this mobility itself, we see it extracting whatever it is through the corridors and the hubs. Obviously, the labor reservoirs, which is region C, where you see Alfred Nzo from Eastern Cape, low socioeconomic health, and also outmigration of vitality. That is the net outmigration from these rolling hills, which could be very, very nice to live in if only they were to be livable. When you measure these kind of spatial discontinuities and imbalances through the law of ZIF, which is basically agglomerations and how the agglomerations occur, you can see this line here represents the siphon, which is the Sandtons and the like. And then, of course, that collapses almost to this siphon line here, which is below, which is really where the siphon in Alexander, the Alex hotbed, City Deep, and another hotbed here. You can see the siphoning it's up here, and here it's where the hotbed is. And that's the data that we get from the census. When you analyze it, it plots this way when you start working on the ZIF. In fact, the ZIF in its origin measured economic agglomerations and how those agglomerations behave. But in South Africa, it's corrupted by what you see as this lower line here, multi-spatial, this one, which shows the siphon where it is the most. So you can see Sikile, inner city, Hillbrow, right inside the city where the ZIF, the gradient of the ZIF is highest. Inside it, it's serious decay. And that contradiction of the decay is what drives the xenophobia and so on. And coupled with this is the issue around how migrants behave. Local migrants do not come to the inner city. They settle around, settle with families, establish, say, in Soweto, or create their own shacks. Migrants from outside occupy the inner city. And they are part then of the decay of the inner city, but at the same time, they are part of the people that take advantage of businesses. And that creates itself, or rather that condition, which is a consequence of the siphon by capital, create contestation between easily identifiable features of people and degenerates in something that certainly becomes very difficult to cope with as South Africa. And hence the xenophobia, a contestation of over crumbs, a contestation over poverty. So the census mesh, which these graphs are generated out of the census data, which I've collected over 40 years. Core economic area, financial, CBD, and government precincts. But these precincts are not entirely precincts. They harbor decay, serious decay, like in Hillbrow. So decadence is very high. And then, of course, these are the manufacturing zones, railheads. Of course, we don't have any rail we can talk about. Logistics pubs. These are things that we have also destroyed. And Region C are the labor reservoirs. But these labor reservoirs are also embedded inside the inner city. And then, of course, in that hotbed, we have this Region D, which is the hotbed of hunger and anomalous flows, zones where things have to be taken to save them from dying, to rescue people from poverty. And then, of course, the mining places are also part of this hotbed region. And this hotbed region here, particularly the shack settlements and the mining periphery, feed this economic region, the economic core that is full of glitter. Now, what you see that once these resources out of the mine, they actually go out as soon as they arrive. 85% of this is externalized. There's also municipal leakage, and then very little local retention as a consequence. Under that kind of situation, it shows that as liquidity enters the township or the rural areas, its local retention is only 12%. It goes out of these places into corporates, but also externalized out of the country. So the pressures around society, and hence what we see as xenophobia, or in fact, Afrophobia, is not caused by just merely not liking people, but it is driven by forces of capital. So if we have to think about the future, we have to think about those people who are not in employment or education and training. And that number goes into the millions of our youth who go to waste. And of course, they have no other way of venting out except to vent to people of different identity as a final method of defense. It's a battle of desperation driven by poor government execution, taking responsibility, and in that colluding with capital. So the contestation barely, therefore, is in the spaza wars, service friction, and identity refraction. So the anger is refracted as from where it belongs, from the service frictions, from the spaza wars, which is basically economic, and then it is seen in identity as the main thing, as an outcome. So when we talk about xenophobia, it is not the cause, but it is the consequence of failure that is marked by the spaza wars, spaza shop wars, and service friction. Now, I have to try and illustrate how this measurement, that is, by measuring the economy appropriately, we are able to identify the culprit and identify the culprit from source. The census helps us to understand the beyond the GDP, which is what Sarkozy asked Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi to do. I think I've been able to answer that question. Because now the GDP, as I measure it, answering the question that Manamela, who was a head of national accounts coming to me almost 20 years ago to say, hey, how do we deal with this head office phenomenon of aggregating things that don't belong to them and making Gauteng a much bigger economy than it really is? In retirement, it looks like I've got that answer. By calculating GDP out-in. And out-in means that I go into the census mesh and measure what is happening in the rural areas where you have two main components in the GDP is labor and capital. The product of that is the GDP.
Sorry, we've lost you there. Pali?
Eunice, connectivity seems to have frozen him.
Yeah.
If we can just give him a minute to
come back, yeah, hopefully
come back here.
We phone him as well.
Would be good.
I'm sure he's aware though. Let me just phone him. No,
you can. He would be aware now because I think he's lost connectivity.
Right. Lost connectivity, I see.
But do phone him.
I'm phoning him. Yeah, you've been cut off for about a minute and a half. And you're completely off. No, you're not on. You look. Yeah, he's trying to reconnect, Jenny. Just look out for him, please.
I'm part of you back, but you're muted. And we no longer have your presentation on the screen.
Yes, I'm getting it there. Okay, share. Can you see my screen?
It is beginning to screen share. We haven't yet, we've now got the screen.
Well, I think I have to remove that one because it's not the right presentation. I'll share another one. Now, is the screen is loading?
Beginning to screen. Yep, it is. And it's the same presentation that we were on. So all you need to do is select the slide and we're ready to go.
I'm trying to get to go to screen. Yes, I was on this particular screen here, where I was saying what one is doing here is an out-in measurement, which does answer the question of beyond the GDP, answers the issues that
Pali, can you hear us?
going into, pardon?
We lost you for about 45 seconds to a minute, so can you go back a bit? Yeah.
Okay, I'm saying I worked on this to actually generate a measure out-in from the in-out. And that measure works on two things. On both ends of the GDP, be it in-out or out-in, you have to measure labor and capital. You have people that are
Hi, again, you're frozen. Can you hear us?
use a different network connection sharing, personal hotspot.
We've got you connected now.
Yes, I'm sure I'll default to my hotspot. So you
Happening again. Pardon? Is it because this particular slide is very busy? Is that the reason that maybe it's demanding on the network?
international have I disappeared again?
Yeah, I don't know enough. Can somebody advise in the meeting? Could it be because the slide is very busy that maybe it uses much more data than normal? That may be a reason. I don't know.
That might be the cause.
I don't know. Yeah.
So, but I've now connected. Let me just go back to my where have I connected? I might have to connect on my.
Well, you're fine for now. So shall we go for it?
Yeah. You're very, very clear now with, yeah.
Pali, once again, we've lost you. Jenny, could it be because of the slide? Does anybody else know? Yeah.
Pardon? Can you hear me now?
The slide, yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have to be on display. So I was explaining how the construct, what I've been talking about, where it comes from and how it has been constructed. So it's out-in. And in its out-in, you are able, when you use the out-in, you are actually able to allocate the value, total value that comes from bottom up. Unlike when you actually find a report from a factory, a manager who says, this is The books are audited and everything, but it doesn't report necessarily on what has been siphoned out of the community. That method I can use, for instance, in Mpumalanga. So every province, every municipality, every district, I can be able to show where value is extracted. For instance, in Mpumalanga, you can see it's Mbombela, Imalahleni, where it has been extracted the longest. And these are the regions where value is extracted. And then the question we have to ask is if there is so much value extracted from these areas, why are the people staying there so poor? Why are they unable to have the absorptive capacity commensurate to the wealth that is being extracted from there? And this is where the answers to this situation of xenophobia have to be found. Xenophobia is a distraction, and it ensures that we don't attend the critical issues of ownership and resource mobilization for a better future. Now, I think you saw this, and that mesh that I've been talking about, I mean, this here is a census mesh. It's about 200 households in each square there that we measure from. So we'll measure that 200 from Emalahleni, and then we'll come and compare where Emalahleni's value is externalized here. So this is where the siphon is in Emalahleni and other areas. And in each province, we can do the same kind of thing. Now, at the aggregate level from, say, 1996 up to 2022, we can see what value has been extracted minus what the labor has contributed. And you'll find that actually labor is actually destroyed, and 14.3 trillion is being extracted. And while the society is left in a vortex at a constant level. And this is the siphoning machine from 1994 to 2026. Where the siphon happens, it's in mines, in finance, because finance and mining are the same. They play in the same, they're in the same WhatsApp group. And then, of course, manufacturing, undermine manufacturing. So the value is externalized immediately. Nothing is processed in the country. And then, of course, when things like that, so it's not surprising that Maluleke, the AG, has given bad record on audits of municipalities. It's by design, it has to be that way. There's no other way. And if you take a municipality like Ditsobotla, where they have even insourced a number of professionals from the private sector, and those professionals are taking 40 million against the 40 million of the budget, in addition to the 50 million of those people that are appointed. And yet, the audits are qualified, despite private sector coming in. So it's false to suggest that private sector can actually help you. In fact, they are the biggest siphon, and that siphoning is externalized. And here, where is it externalized from? 12 trillion from blacks, 715 from color, 286 billion from Indians, and 1.37 trillion from whites themselves. And by sex, it's 9.2 trillion from females, 5.1 trillion from the male population. And we have eaten the future of our children by taking 1.54 trillion from that through this siphon. So the issues that are driving xenophobia are much more profound than what we see. And we are attacking the wrong target. The right target is capital itself. And because of what capital is doing, labor employment declines, people disappear. That is, the labor disappears because it's not visible in factories. And we can see how that has increased rapidly over time. With it is the disappearance of democracy or collapse of democracy. So I've introduced this labor disappearance index as well as collapse of democracy index. So there are bigger issues at stake than fighting the person who has a different color. And we are scapegoating our problems to a small number of 3.5 million people who were born outside, amongst which there are South Africans, because there are South Africans who were born outside. We have magnified, as a consequence, what really doesn't matter, doesn't count. I'm not suggesting that people should stay in South Africa illegally, but the fundamental problem, if we were to pound for pound, capital is the biggest culprit that is undermining us as a country, rather than the migrants. Now, what we have ended with in terms of miserizing growth that Bagwati speaks about is that when we measure, we find that there is an miserization. So everything falls below this line and is miserizing. That's where the siphon is. And that miserization continues at the national macro average as well as at an individual enumeration area or Tembisa ward or whatever it is. And the grant, the 350 Rand grant, goes to the shopping, is siphoned by the shops and external cartels, just as the mining is siphoned by big business. What we need to do is to work on a collective pooling of these kinds of resources and harmonizing aggregates so that we change the path of the ZIF. So whatever I said, this is the formula that we actually use to try and understand. So the siphon, the difference between the value that is here that has been measured on the maps, as I've said, that here must be almost minus what is being siphoned here, must be close to zero. That's the equation that we must use in our plans and say, is this value compared to what is being siphoned closer to zero? If that's the case, then the plan passes. At the moment, our plans will show, whatever plan that we put on the table will show that this value here is far smaller than the value that comes from here. So all the time, we end up with a siphon. So until and unless our planning system is informed by this log, policy log number 99, which is, according to my ledger, where the function SMI approaches zero, which means we are locking wealth. And these are tools that we must use. And they must tell us ahead of time what it is we are engaging in. When we don't have these tools, then we'll always see green shoots. For the last 15 years, even the person who wrote in the Daily Maverick, I can't remember, it was December or November, and he made a disclaimer about many, many things. But he was convinced that there are green shoots. There are no green shoots. And if I put everything in, which I've done, the value between this, the net value here, is not approaching zero. It is that 0.85 of the siphon that makes South Africa lose. So we really have to move from palliatives of 350 distress fund to structural ownership. And the path there is very clear from what I've presented by measuring out in and looking value where value is created rather than taking it. So the Nagalamutromi has to anchor establishing a permanent multi-generational aggregate asset base, which is the mines. And then, of course, for security, unified indicator to actually deal with the cartels from infiltrating the meshes. If we lock value where activities are, then we can actually ensure that the cartels are stopped from infiltrating. And of course, devolving to communal aggregate asset bases, replacing state grant dependency, which is basically increasing democracy, increasing participation for self-management. So, Chair, what is to be done? The 2,752 instruments of the Lehohla ledger, based on Nakala Mutlomi, have things like Code 1, which is transition to regional convergence frameworks that match communal asset at source. And then, of course, securing local meshes, which is utilizing decentralized ledger techniques, technologies to ensure intermediate multipliers that ensure that value stays local. Structural courage, which means moving beyond standard budgeting folios to fundamentally re-engineer the economic flow, and advancing to socialism, creating the material conditions where identity no longer functions as a weapon for survival. Chair, my final verdict is that the numbers do not lie. We must re-anchor the floor. And what I created in measuring GDP is a very transparent lens that identifies the evil, the siphon. And while illegality is not tolerable, but to exaggerate it to the extent that we have made South Africa to lose everything that it has been known for, it's certainly reckless at the highest level of governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Comrade Pali. Comrades, over to you. Questions? There's some issues raised in the chat group. So